Here we have a line of dialogue. Let me play it for you first.
This is way too much for me.
It's a very short, very simple line. Let's hear it again.
This is way too much for me.
Now let's assume that your job is to animate a scene around this line of dialogue. What's the best way to go about it? Well, the first thing that you do is to try to discover where the accents are. Now, firstly, I've made it a little simpler here in that I've made these little notes showing exactly where each word appears. Let's play it again and watch that.
This is way too much for me.
So that was a good use of time. So let's find out where the accents are. Let's play it again.
This is way too much for me.
So do you hear where he says way?
This is way too much for me.
You can almost feel the voice lifting up.
This is way too much for me.
So what I'm going to do is get the brush tool, and you can do this on paper if you like. I'm going to draw on the dialogue layer where I've written out the dialogue by hand.
This is way too much for me.
This is way too much for me. So I'm thinking way is the high point. So let's make a little dot up here.
This is way too much for me.
Let's listen to the beginning again. This is
way too much for me.
seems like this is coming down
This is way too much for me.
before soaring up on way. So I'm going to guess roughly that we're looking at the S sound as the low point.
This is way too much for me.
So we're starting a little higher and we're coming down to the S sound before going up to way.
This is way too much for me.
And let's listen to the rest again.
This is way too much for me.
Now, at this point, you're probably going nuts because you've been listening to the sound file looping. This is what you do. You listen to it until the sound almost becomes music.
This is way too much for me.
I'm hearing it down on the ch of much.
This is way too much for me.
And so what I'm going to do is simplify this. We could probably go in and put all kinds of little bumps, but for such a short line, I think we're coming in on a single path down to here.
This is way too much for me. This is way too much for me.
And me at the end seems to have a little lift at the end.
This is way too much for me.
So around here, little higher, not as high as this.
This is way too much for me.
There we go.
This is way too much for me.
Now, why have we done this? Because these accents will determine the actual animation of the character's body. And the biggest movements of the body should, all things being equal, correspond to the biggest accent. So the biggest accent that we have happens right on this point. And in the next section, I'll show you how we can apply this little graph to the animation of the figure itself.